This is the story of a remarkable family.
It is a beautiful city of ours, this Sydney, made a little bit better, if you don't mind my saying so, by the contribution of the Irish. Yes, over the years we came in our thousands, many of us getting off the boat just across the way here, and from there going forward to populate and multiply. We're good at that, you know, and so it seems with the Carr family. That's right, the Carrs. And it all started over 100 years ago with Frederick and Dolly back in Mulhuddard in County Dublin. Dublin, at the turn of the 20th century, was racked by political turmoil and grinding poverty. It was against this bleak backdrop that Frederick Joseph Carr met and courted Catherine Lennon, later to be known and loved as Dolly.
Huge poverty in Dublin in 1912. 33% of all families in Dublin lived in one-room tenements. The tenements of Dublin were considered to be the worst slums in the United Kingdom. Hugely high infant mortality rates, very, very bad hygiene, very, very bad disease.
While poverty was rampant in Ireland, the Carrs were not poor. The family home, Parslickstown House in Mulhuddard near Dublin, stood on 163 acres of prime farming land and provided Francis and Mary Carr and their 9 sons and 3 daughters a well-respected and comfortable lifestyle.
They ran stock on it, and they lived in a very large house, actually, a Georgian house it would have been described as, and it had 8 rooms on one wing and another 8 rooms on the other wing. In the long wing, it was called the Bowery, actually, and all the Carr boys lived in that section. There was a band room where they had musical concerts. They must have all been musical. And there was another room where they had other gatherings. So they entertained, and obviously they were entertained by other landholders in the area.
The story of the ancestral home and the Carr family circumstances were recounted many years later in Fred's daughter Madge's memoirs. It's formed the basis of the family's understanding of those early days in Ireland and the move to Australia.
Our parents were upper-class Irish, which meant a lot to them, but very little to us. The upper classes were the idle rich and landowners. The middle classes consisted of storekeepers and employers generally, while the lower classes were peasants and unskilled workers.
The days of class distinction are now a thing of the past in modern-day Ireland. Times have changed, and so too Parslickstown House, the old family home since 1840. It still stands, as many members of the Australian branch of the family have found out on visits over the years. But it passed out of family hands in 1955. The last owners, Tim and Cess Carr, received the princely sum of £12,000 for their home. After renovations in the 80s, it now operates as a community centre surrounded not by rolling fields, but housing estates.
Little did the Carrs know what they were leaving for the people. I just think that we always say the claim to fame for Parsixtown House was that Parnell had tea on the lawn. Well, I can guarantee you there's been hundreds of people that have had tea in Parsixtown House. They have done personal development courses, they have done community development courses, they have met with the council, with the guards, to kind of just keep Mulhuddard area a good area to live in. So when the Carrs came here and built this house, and I mean when we moved in here it was just all green, it was fields, it was the edge of the community, but when you look at it now we're right in the middle of the community.
Not far from the old family home in Mulhuddard Cemetery are more than a dozen tombstones that mark the final resting place of Carr family members going back 5 generations.
My own parents are buried just over here to the left, Jimmy and Annie. Dad was the caretaker of the graveyard for many, many years. As children, we were brought up here while Dad might have been digging a grave, and we played for hours, endless hours. People would come into the graveyard with their records, with their numbers. The map meant nothing. Dad just knew where every grave was.
It was in nearby Dublin, in the Church of the Holy Family in Ockram Street on the 18th of October 1905, that Fred married Catherine Mary Lenihan, the second daughter of a wealthy city family.
Frederick and Catherine, are you willing to accept with love the children God may send you and bring them up in accordance with the law of Christ and His Church?
A record of the ceremony can be found in the Church's ancient archives.
I invite you then to declare before God and His Church, Frederick and Catherine, your consent to become husband and wife.
It was not long before their first child came along. Born in this house in 1906, Dolly's parents' home, which still stands in North Circular Road. They named their son Frank after Fred's father. Life was not easy for the struggling young couple. Fred worked as a corn factor, a middleman in the buying and selling of corn, when they moved to this tiny home in Palmerston near the city. It was there that May was born in 1908, and Fred followed 2 years later. Political unrest and poverty in the Irish capital, meanwhile, were getting worse, forcing many to flee to England or further afield. Fred's elder brothers, George and Jim, had already left for Australia. George stayed and actively encouraged him to seek a better life there.
There were about 80 boats leaving the port of Dublin every week for Britain. The poorest emigrants would have left for Britain, passage money being cheaper. The wealthier, the better off, such as the Carrs, would have gone to Australia, where passage money was higher. And it appears as if the Carrs, Frederick, received this money, this passage money, as his start in life, in the same way as his older brother had received the family farm.
That there was unrest political unrest in Dublin and on at the time. The whole business of the Irish nationalism was rising. There was very strong anti-British feeling, and so that's where it started. And I think that's why Fred and Dolly, after they were married, decided that they go to Australia.
And so, with the money 31-year-old Fred received for his start in life, he purchased third-class steerage tickets for his wife and 3 young children to sail from Liverpool to Sydney. It was an arduous 8-week journey on the 10,000-ton steamship, the Waimana. They left port on December the 23rd, 1911, just months before the Titanic left the same port to be lost in the Atlantic. Dolly's letters to Jessie in Sydney gave a sense of the hardships they endured.
For the first few days, it was terribly rough. One of the small boats was washed away coming through the Bay of Biscay. We were all very sick. Only Freddie kept in attendance, and I don't know how it would have been, as there weren't many creature comforts here. We had an outbreak of scarlet fever after leaving Cape Town, and almost the first case was taken from my cabin. I was in a terrible state, fearing the children would take it. But thank God they are so far safe. I only hope we will land safely.
Dolly had 3 small children. My mother was only 3, and Fred Jr., he was only 18 months old. She shared a cabin with another woman who was English, which would have been absolutely abhorrent to her, who also had several small children. It was a 4-bunk cabin, and there were 2 women and 6 children in it, and Fred was down in steerage with the men. All the men travelled in steerage. Dolly was beside herself.
Being pregnant and not knowing where little Frankie was, you know, he was with the men and the boys, so no, that would have been awful.
The food supplies were inadequate. There was no milk for the children. There was mainly pease pudding to eat. So that, yeah, it was fairly rough. By the time they got to Fremantle, quite a few people had died. There'd been an outbreak of some disease on the ship, and yeah, very happy to get to Fremantle. Yeah.
55 days after leaving Liverpool, the Waimana steamed into Sydney Harbour on the 12th of February 1912. Its passenger manifest showing the Carrs among the 65 immigrant families seeking a new life. There to meet them was Fred's brother George, the man who would become a constant throughout their lives in Sydney. His granddaughter Mary Ann recounts the colourful arrival, which has become family legend.
My granddad was one for great occasions, actually, and this was going to be a real beauty. So instead of waiting on the wharfs for the passengers to all arrive and so on, he decided that he would get himself out in a little rowboat, I assume at that stage, and in true Irish fashion and a great welcome to his brother, he shouts up to the deck where he'd spied them and said, "Can you keep one down?" No doubt there was a bottle of his favourite spirit, rum, or maybe a bottle of the good old Aussie beer. Who knows?
Oh, I can imagine it would have been a most exciting of times for them to see George in the boat, you know, rowing out to meet them, and a new country, a new life. Scary, really scary. But, yes, I think it would have been quite adventurous. And they're obviously adventurous people.
Australia at the turn of the 20th century was quite a bit different to the country of Fred and Dolly's birth, but the accents they were soon to encounter were not. They settled in the Sydney suburb of Leichhardt, an Irish immigrant enclave where baby George was born 6 weeks later. Fred's brother George and his English wife Jessie lived close by in Kalgoorlie Street, and so too this lady, Madge Turton, who would become Dolly's lifelong friend. It was Madge who first rented and then sold them the 2-bedroom house the family would call home for more than 30 years. And here it is, this tiny little workman's cottage at 105 Allen Street, Leichhardt. This is where Fred and Dolly brought up 7 sons and 2 daughters. It's now owned by a single man, and I've got a feeling that maybe he hears the ghosts of a very large family every now and again. It was in Allen Street that Madge was born in 1914, followed by Jim a year later, then Michael in 1917, Patrick in 1922, and Gregory rounded out the family in 1925. It was one very crowded house.
It's really tiny. It's 2 bedrooms inside, and this side area here is enclosed now, but it was a veranda that ran the length of the house. It was enclosed, and the 7 boys slept in that little tiny space. Before that veranda was enclosed, I think this is the dining room here, they actually did sleep in the dining room, and Auntie Madge tells us that the last one in had to sleep on the table.
Just the sleeping accommodation, something that you couldn't comprehend in this day and age, you know. It was probably a normal thing for them. It just happened as each child came along. That had to be made room for another one, so they did. So they just added another bed. These days we add another room or we add a wing or something to our homes, but they couldn't. So I imagine it would have been frightfully hard.
There was no harder workplace in Sydney than on the wharves. This was where Fred was to find work with brother George under the infamous bull system, which favoured only the biggest and strongest workers. Fred fitted that description nicely and was soon a member of the Wharf Labourers' Union, competing for the longest shifts to help feed his growing family.
Working on the wharves was something that he did by choice to support his family. He often volunteered for a 24-hour shift, and a 24-hour shift on the wharves was worth 1 week's pay. And that meant an enormous amount to them as the family grew and grew and grew and grew. A gang of hooligans came at him out of the shadows as he was coming away from the wharves very, very early in the morning after a 24-hour shift. And they were after his money. They knew he'd done 24 hours. And he just produced his hook, and they all backed off.
I think that he had always, dressed properly to go to work, and I'd imagine that was just what he did. He never saw himself as working class. I think that's probably the basis of it all. He was always better than that.
Fred and George both upheld the sartorial elegance in those days. Apparently my grandfather always had a bowler hat and a rakish sort of slant to it, but coming from Ireland, they still carried on the fashion of you go to work and you wear your suit and your tie. So walking down the streets in Leichhardt, off to the wharves they were going, but they had the bowler hat and the shillelagh, which my grandfather always carried along, and no one would have assumed that they were off to work on the wharves in those times.
In the early days, Dolly struggled to bring up her fast-growing family. The Catholic faith was pivotal to their daily lives. All the children's communions were well documented and appropriately celebrated, but drama was never far away. In 1915, as Australian soldiers were fighting in the First World War, baby Jim almost died of a chest infection. This studio photo only taken because his mother didn't think he'd make it. In 1917, Sydney was rocked by a general strike, which saw thousands of workers down tools and public transport grind to a halt. It coincided with the birth of Michael, later described by Dolly as a skinny, quiet, timid little fellow who, because he was born during the strike, never seemed to know where his next meal was coming from. Times were tough and got tougher when the industrial action spread nationwide across all industries, including the wharves. Fred was out of work again, and through it all, Dolly held things together as only a mother can.
She always looked very calm and serene, and I don't remember hearing anyone ever say that she complained or was cranky. She seemed to be able to just take it all in a stride, but it must have been hard.
The darkest days for the struggling Carr family came 2 years later, when the Spanish flu pandemic ravaged Australia, killing 6,000 people in Sydney and 12,000 nationwide. Dolly and 2 of the older children were stricken. Madge's memoirs recorded those terrible days in 1919.
My mother and 2 of the older children caught it, and my father sent for the priest to administer the last rites of the church to them. Our parish priest was a fine old Irish gentleman, and as well as arriving with the last sacrament, he also brought with him 2 large bottles of whisky, and told Dad that he was not to enter the sick room to attend to my mother without first filling his mouth with whisky, as a preventative measure against catching the disease himself. Aunt Madge came to stay with us to help Dad, and she supplied the whisky for both of them for the duration of the illness. It was good medicine. Neither of them caught it. They carried out the old priest's instructions to the letter.
There was no cure, no known cure for the bubonic plague, and people just died in their thousands. My father can remember as a child seeing coffins stacked on Stanmore railway station ready to be taken out to Rookwood Cemetery. So it was pretty terrible.
Apparently when Nana Carr arose from her sickbed, they weren't quick enough, and she discovered this enormous pile of whiskey bottles in the backyard. And they both said very dutifully, but Father said that we had to take a mouthful of whiskey before we entered the sick room.
With Dolly recovered, the job of raising a family continued. The many photos taken record the progress of the children. They may have been hard times in the early years in Leichhardt, but with 9 children there was also plenty of fun and laughter, and yes, music. Dolly was a fine pianist who had studied at the Conservatorium in Dublin. Family get-togethers around the treasured piano were a must, and everyone sang or played an instrument, a pastime still embraced by many members of the Carr clan.
Everything happened around the piano. Everyone stood around the piano and sang. Everyone stood around the piano and drank. Everyone sat around the room and listened. It all happened in the room the piano was in. And it was a significant part of their family.
At some stage or other in the night, some of the boys would sing their particular songs. I think Frank sang Makushla, Greg Some Enchanted Evening, and I can't remember who sang Ave Maria, but they all had beautiful voices.
Another significant part of the Carr story is the time the family spent on the beach. Clifton Gardens has changed a lot over the years, but in the 1920s they could buy for 2 shillings a family ferry ticket and come and picnic here in the sand. Another favourite spot was Cronulla Beach, a long way from Leichhardt. Much time in Madge's memoirs is devoted to fond memories of annual holidays by the sea. For £1 a week, the family rented Restmore in Cronulla, a tiny timber cottage in which the whole clan could barely fit.
We had great times at the beach. We were all good swimmers and body surfers and would go swimming out further and further looking for the big wave. To crack a big one was one of the biggest thrills of all. It was such an exhilarating feeling to come down with the wave and be carried into the shore with a foam of surf bubbling around your ears. We were all very competitive and would just about bust our boilers to keep up with the older ones, and would skite about who caught the best wave and laugh at those who got dumped.
And they always seemed to be not just one family, but there was 3 or 4 of them. There was never just Nan and Pop and, say, Nan and Grandfather and 1 or 2 of the children. There was always a lot of people. It seemed like a picnic was arranged and everyone went there for the day and enjoyed it.
In 1928, the family was rocked by terrible news. Fred's brother and everyone's favourite uncle, George, died at the age of 52. He was survived by his wife, Jessie, and 12-year-old daughter, Dimps, who was subsequently placed in an orphanage.
Dimps would have been just totally cut up, I think, about the whole thing. She would have been in total grief. Her mother, Jessie, would have just panicked. I don't think she would have had a straight thought in her head what to do money-wise, how she'd cope. And Dimps was put into the convent at St Martha's there, just around the corner.
The biggest test for the Carrs came during the Great Depression, when 7 of the children were still living at home. The pay packets of those who worked were vital in keeping the family afloat. There was little work for Fred on the wharfs, so Frank left school at 12 for a job in a dairy and later to drive buses. May was earning good money as a bookkeeper. Madge left school when she was 14 to work in an office, while Fred found employment as a plasterer, Jim as a pastry cook, and George a butcher.
There's no such thing as keeping your pay packet to yourself. The pay packet was put on the kitchen table every Friday night. And so the more children you had, the more children that paid for the others.
I mean, particularly during the Depression, I mean, I just love that bit that Madge has written about, and Madge herself was a very, very generous-hearted person. But, you know, they'd come home and make a big pot of stew of some sort from the market, and then Nana Carr would ladle it into a billy can and send so-and-so up the road to Mrs. So-and-so, who didn't have any food in the house for her family, so that, you know, they all would have to do without.
Grandfather went into work very, very early in the morning, and before he went into the wharves, he went to the markets, the fruit and vegetable markets, and he got whatever was going cheap in boxes, and he had one of the boys with him that he would load onto the tram and send them back with whatever they managed to get, like a bushel of peas or a case of fruit, stone fruits or apples or oranges or whatever was going cheap, and send them back on the tram. And Dolly would have two boys waiting at the other end at the tram stop to help them back with the billy cart and the fruit and vegetables back home, and they would all hop in and shell the peas and do all the cutting of the fruit and things, and for preserves and jams and things. And they'd have it all done before they went to school.
For many Irish Catholics living in Leichhardt, church and school were central to their lives. It was no different for the Carr family. All the children attended St. Columba's School, run by the Sisters of St. Joseph. It was just a short walk from the family home, and still stands educating and giving spiritual comfort to the locals.
Both Dolly and Fred were dedicated Catholics, and they instilled that in their children from a very early age. So their whole lives revolved around the parish.
Oh, well, I think religion was a major part of the cohesiveness of the family because they prayed together and they went to Mass together. I mean, it was a very well-known ritual in Irish families that Saturday night everyone had a wash and the copper was boiled and everyone was scrubbed down and everyone fronted up to 9 o'clock Mass the next morning.
Faith was very, very important, and it was a very simple faith that the Irish had, and it spilled over into every aspect of their life. Nana Carr's box of treasures, which my mother gave to me, contains every First Communion medal her children ever received, every confirmation medal. She was more interested in their faith development than she was in anything else in their lives.
All of us have very strong family values, and I think that there's something very Catholic about that. I think our values were shaped by the church, all of us. Some of us have stayed as practising Catholics and some of us haven't.
Photographs during the 30s could not disguise just how close the family had become. Hard times had only forged a stronger bond. May and Madge had become good tennis players, and it wasn't long before young men came a-calling and wedding dresses got an airing. Madge's memoirs captured the hilarity of living in the warm embrace of a big family.
No bad language was ever used in our home. Pat was a very solemn little boy, and he came home one day and told Dad that there was a bad word written on the cemetery fence. "What sort of bad word?" asked Dad, and Pat got very close to my father's ear and whispered, "S-H-I-T," spelling it out instead of saying such a dreadful word. "Oh my goodness," said Dad. "Go down to the bathroom at once and wash your mouth out with Lifebuoy soap." This was the usual punishment for any of us who dared to use a swear word or any other vulgar language. And even when we were growing up, if a damn or a blast happened to slip out, we would be told very smartly to keep that sort of language for our highfalutin friends.
He was a very quiet, gentle man, I thought. He never said much. He'd sit in his chair with his pipe in his mouth and his hat on his head and his cuspidor between his feet, commonly called a spittoon. Cuspidor is a nice name. And he would sit there and he'd see everything that went on, not say much, or say very little in fact, but he was always there and he was always a presence.
Madge's memoirs also recall the special affection Fred and Dolly had for the family pets. Junie the dog and a very special Cocky, the pet galah.
Cocky had the life of Riley, the same as the poodle had the life of Riley. Everybody had to pick thistles for him, and Cocky learned to talk. And Gregory, who was the youngest, often got lost at dinner time or was late coming home or something, and everybody'd be calling out, "Gregory, Gregory," and the Cocky would be calling out, "Gregory, Gregory." And then the lady next door was a bit afraid of them. She was English, and there were this tribe of Irish next to her, and she'd be sticking her head over the fence and calling out, "Are you there, Mrs. Carr?" because the ball had landed in her vegetable patch or something or other, and Cocky would call out, "Are you there, Mrs. Carr? Are you there, Mrs. Carr?" And the lady next door stopped doing that because she was so embarrassed. And Cocky was also known to know when it was raining, particularly if the washing was out. If the washing was out, he'd dance up and down and call out, "It's raining, Mrs. Carr, it's raining, Mrs. Carr."
1942, and with war raging in Europe and the Pacific, a number of the Carr boys answered the call. Fred signed up early and saw action in England, North Africa and Palestine before heading to New Guinea. Greg joined the Air Force and flew Mustangs over Japan, while Pat served with the Army in Darwin. Tragically, Fred, the lovable larrikin of the family, was killed in fierce fighting just days after arriving in New Guinea.
Fred and his mother had a particular bond that seems to be stronger than any other member of the family. He was the black sheep, and I think his mother had a very special place in her heart, and I think he recognised that. And he would do anything, and he would work any job, whether it was boxing with Jimmy Sharman or it was cutting cane in northern Queensland, to earn money so he could send it back to the family. That was his token of love to his family, that if he worked really hard and sent the money back, the family would survive.
Fred was survived by his wife of only 2 years, Nellie, who would never remarry. It was devastating news for Dolly, who had been following her son closely through letters he would send from the places he served. The family would always get a laugh from what he had to report.
During the war, he wrote 32 letters to his mother. Now, his 32 letters to his mother, he could have been a tourist. He talks about the scenery, the people he meets, the places he's been. There's absolutely nothing about the horror of war. His letter from Libya starts out, "Mum, if anyone tells you they get sunburnt on the roof of their mouth in Libya, it's because the mountains are so bloody high." So he must have been walking around with his, sort of looking at the mountains.
News of their son's death reached them not long after Fred and Dolly had moved to Cronulla. Tragically, Dolly would succumb to cancer and die just 5 months later.
She was the heart of the family. Her life was so different, I'd imagine, to what she thought it would be when she was a girl in Ireland. She had quite a privileged upbringing, and being one of 2 daughters. And she, when she married Fred and came to Australia, I think her life was incredibly happy, but very, very hard.
Life in Sydney in the late 40s was returning to something resembling normal after the dark days of war. Fred had moved back to Leichhardt to live with daughter May and her family in Flood Street, and as patriarch of the fast-growing Carr clan, he was kept busy attending the many celebrations. "38 years after bringing his family to Australia, and at the age of 70, Frederick Joseph Carr joined his beloved wife Dolly, leaving his large family to carry on, and to pass on the values they had tried so hard to instill in their children.
What we have to produce for the younger generation coming up is good memories that I can give them of former times of my grandparents and their great-grandparents and so forth, and for them to realise that in their own families there are good memories, and when this is finished they then have to turn around to look to see what good memories they can find in their own family groups, and then they carry on the story from there.
And the story will be carried on from here, for each branch of this very large family has prepared a small presentation which will soon follow. So all that's left for me to do is to congratulate you all and wish you all the best for the celebration of your centenary of coming to this beautiful land. And I think there might be a message from the old country.
This Miragrit, and greetings to all our Australian cousins from Mulhuddard. I know Jimmy and Annie would have loved to have been there with you today. I hope you have a great day, and we'll definitely have one here with you on the 12th. Bannock Day agus Slán go fóill from all of us here.